The next part we're going to talk about then is audience. We talked about subject and purpose. Now we're going to talk about audience. And it's last in our list, but it could come first in your decision making because audience helps us a lot. We are deciding who we are writing to. Who we are writing to. Now, in our classes, most of the time we are writing to the professor. I prefer that we consider that our audience is our classmates, people that are your peers. And that should help you to balance out some of the other decisions that we have to make based on the audience. So why is audience so important and why should we consider it maybe even first? If we know the audience, what are the key things that brings for us, right? So there are several things that we want to keep in mind about audience. Knowing who we're writing to tells us many things. It can tell us, so what approach do I take? What approach? Right, so even not only the approach to take with that topic based on that audience, but we're also maybe even going to consider whenever we're talking about that, maybe even choice. And so if my audience is us, or if my audience is a group of high school seniors, then, or third year students, right, in high school, if that's my audience, then maybe that's going to affect my choice for my topic. But it's also going to affect how do I approach that topic. Do I approach it in a light way, in a serious way, right? Do I use a lot of statistics or those things? So it's going to help me to choose. Also, vocabulary. It's also going to help me decide what kind of vocabulary do I want to use. If I'm talking to a very young audience or to an inexperienced audience, then I might need to explain some things and use more simple vocabulary. And the other thing about vocabulary is that I can't assume that my audience understands everything that I'm going to be talking about. But if my audience knows some information that you keep giving them, then that's going to be irritating to that audience as well. So for example, if we're talking about using a computer, because we're all using computers, I don't need to tell you how to turn on the computer or about checking your power supply or where the keyboard is or where anything located on the computer is, or how to open a program, or mostly how to save files or send files or do those things. You already know all of those things. So based on you as my audience, I can talk about some other aspects about the computer. I don't need to start with the beginning. If you're talking to your grandmother or your grandfather, maybe you have to start there. You have to make sure that they know what each of these terms mean. Even some key terms like mouse and monitor, because mouse has multiple meanings and monitor also has multiple meanings, and it may not be something that an older person, inexperienced person would know that's what it is. So audience tells me what vocabulary and what kind of vocabulary that I need to be using whenever I am writing. Right? So a couple of other things we can determine from that is also about format. For us, we're going to be following essay structure, but in some situations you might be able to write a little more casually based on that audience. Maybe I want to write in shorter paragraphs if I'm writing to a younger, more inexperienced audience. Right? So what format do I use? Is it a very formal, very structured format? Is it a very casual kind of format? It's decided by my audience. And the other things that we're going to do is we want to kind of fits into our vocabulary about explaining kinds of things. But for me, I think it's important because it tells us, well, with this group, what kind of examples can I use? We want to explain things, and most of the time we want to explain through using examples. I need to know who my audience is, what is their experience, what information do they already have, so that I can use appropriate examples. If I was going to explain, let's say I want to explain American football, and you don't understand what American football is, and when you hear the word football you think it's soccer, but it's not. So American football is very, very different. So maybe you have some idea about rugby because it's fairly popular here. So American football is a little more similar to rugby. So I would use maybe some rugby example because you know about that, but maybe you don't know about football. I'm not going to use a lot of phrases or expressions like touchdown or first down on the first try, or he's going for the long bomb. All of those are expressions that are related to American football, and maybe it's not something that you are familiar with. Now, if I want to use a sports example, then maybe I would use penalty kicks, or I would use yellow card or red card, because you're probably much more aware and have much more experience with those kinds of terms. So audience is so important for helping us to decide. If I'm talking to you about a library or the library, I don't have to tell you where the library is, I hope. Well, you already know where the library is, but if you're talking to a group who's outside of our university, maybe you have to explain where the library is. Now, you don't have to explain what the library is, maybe to any audience, unless it's a very, very young audience. So we don't have to explain what it is, but we might need to explain where the library is if you're talking to someone who isn't aware of this structure. All right, so knowing my audience is so important for helping us to decide not just what we write, but how we will write it, how we will structure it, what kinds of examples that we're going to be using. So that's where we are up to this point. So we talked about, we have subject, purpose, and audience, and we can choose them in lots of different orders. If maybe I get a writing assignment that says, please write a persuasive paper, right? So maybe I get that part first. Maybe I know the subject first. Maybe I'm in a literature class and I have to talk about maybe Shakespeare or something that we've been reading in class. And we already know our audience is the professor, or maybe it's the class if the professor allows that. Most of the time it might be for the class itself. And so we have our subject, we have our purpose, we have our audience, and they could be mixed up about when we're choosing them. Most of the time when we're writing for school, we know the purpose, it's to inform. We know the audience is the professor most of the time. And sometimes that causes us problems because we tend to overwrite, and that just makes our writing not as strong and not as clear, and maybe a little more confusing because we're trying to elevate our vocabulary and maybe use some words that we don't really understand perfectly well. So it's better to write to the best student that you have in your class, right? So we're using that as our audience, and because that's our audience, then that helps us to decide all of these things.